Day 4, the ninth story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 4, the ninth story. Sieur Guillaume de Roussillon slays his wife's paramour, Sieur Guillaume de Capestange, and gives her his heart to eat. She, coming to wit thereof, throws herself from a high window to the ground, and dies, and is buried with her lover.
Nay, Phyllis' story, which had not failed to move the gossips to no little pity, being ended, none now remained to speak but the king, and Dioneo, whose privilege the king was minded not to infringe. Wherefore he thus began.
I propose, compassionate my ladies, to tell you a story, which, seeing that you so commiserate ill-starred loves, may claim no less a share of your pity than the last, insomuch as they were greater folks of whom I shall speak, and that which befell them was more direful. You are to know then, as the Provençals relate, that there was in Provence two noble knights, each having castles and vassals under him, the one Sieur Guillaume de Roussillon, and the other Sieur Guillaume de Capestange. And being both most doughty warriors, they were as brothers, and went ever together, and bearing the same device to tournament or joust or other passages of arms. And albeit each dwelt in his own castle, and the castles were a good 10 miles apart, it nevertheless came to pass that Sieur Guillaume de Roussillon, having a most lovely lady and amorous withal to wife, Sieur Guillaume de Capestange, for all they were such friends and comrades, became inordinately enamored of the lady, who by this, that, and the other sign that he gave, discovered his passion, and knowing him for the most complete knight, was flattered, and returned it, insomuch that she yearned and burned for him above all else in the world, and waited only till he should make his suit to her, as before long he did, and so they met from time to time, and great was their love. Which intercourse they ordered with so little discretion that 'twas discovered by the husband, who was very wroth, insomuch that the great love which he bore to Capestange was changed into mortal enmity, and, dissembling it better than the lovers their love, he made his mind up to kill Capestange. Now it came to pass that, while Roussillon was in this frame, a great tourney was proclaimed in France, whereof Roussillon sent forth word to Capestange, and bade him to his castle. So he reminded to come, that there they might discuss whether or no to go to the tourney, and how. Capestange was overjoyed, and made answer that he would come to sup with him the next day without fail. Which message being delivered, Roussillon wist that the time was come to slay Capestange. So next day he armed himself, and attended by a few servants took horse, and about a mile from his castle lay in ambush in a wood through which Capestange must needs pass. He waited for some time, then he saw Capestange approach, unarmed, with 2 servants behind, also unarmed, for he was without thought of peril on Roussillon's part. So Capestange came unto the place of Roussillon's choice, and then, fell and vengeful, Roussillon leapt forth lance in hand, and fell upon him, exclaiming, "Thou art a dead man!" And the words were no sooner spoken than the lance was through Capestange's breast. Powerless either to defend himself, or even utter a cry, Capestange fell to the ground, and soon expired. His servants waited not to see who had done the deed, but turned their horses' heads, and fled with all speed to their lord's castle. Roussillon dismounted, and opened Capestange's breast with a knife, and took out the heart with his own hands, wrapped it up in a banderole, and gave it to one of his servants to carry. He then bade none make bold to breathe a word of the affair, mounted his horse, and rode back ('twas not night) to his castle. The lady, who had been told that Capestange was to come to supper that evening, was all impatience till he should come, and was greatly surprised to see her husband arrive without him. Wherefore, "How is this, my lord?" said she. "Why tarries Capestange?" "Madam," answered her husband, "I have tidings from him that he cannot be here until tomorrow." Whereat the lady was somewhat disconcerted. Having dismounted, Roussillon called the cook, and said to him, "Here is a boar's heart. Take it, and make thereof the daintiest and most delicious dish thou canst, and when I am set at table serve it in a silver porringer. So the cook took the heart, and expended all his skill and pains upon it, mincing it, and mixing with it plenty of good seasoning, and made thereof an excellent ragout. And in due time Sieur Guillaume and his lady set them down to table. The meat was served, but Sieur Guillaume, his mind engrossed with his crime, ate but little. The cook set the ragout before him, but he, feigning that he cared to eat no more that evening, had it passed on to the lady, and highly commended it. The lady, nothing loath, took some of it, and found it so good that she ended by eating the whole. Whereupon, "Madam," quoth the knight, "how liked you this dish?" "In good faith, my lord," replied the lady, "not a little." "So help me God," returned the knight, "I dare to be sworn you did. 'Tis no wonder that you should enjoy that dead which you living enjoyed more than aught else in the world." For a while the lady was silent. Then, "How say you?" said she. "What is it you have caused me to eat?" "That which you have eaten," replied the knight, "was in good sooth the heart of Sieur Guillaume de Cabestang, whom you, disloyal woman that you are, did so much love. For assurance whereof I tell you that, but a short while before I came back, I plucked it from his breast with my own hands." It boots not to ask if the lady was sorrow stricken to receive such tidings of her best beloved. But after a while she said, "'Twas the deed of a disloyal and recreant knight. For if I, unconstrained by him, made him lord of my love, and thereby did you wrong, 'twas I, not he, who should have borne the penalty. But God forbid that fare of such high excellence as the heart of a knight, so true and courteous as Sieur Guillaume de Cabestang, be followed by aught else." So saying, she started to her feet, and stepping back to a window that was behind her, without a moment's hesitation let herself drop backwards therein. The window was at a great height from the ground, so the lady was not only killed by the fall, but almost reduced to atoms. Stunned and conscience-stricken by the spectacle, and fearing the vengeance of the country folk and the Count of Provence, Sieur Guillaume had his horses saddled and rode away. On the morrow the whole countryside knew how the affair had come about. Wherefore folk from both of the castles took the two bodies, and bore them with grief and lamentation exceeding great to the church in the lady's castle, and laid them in the same tomb, and caused verses to be inscribed thereof, signifying who they were that were there interned, and the manner and occasion of their death. End of Day 4, the 9th story.
Day 4, the 10th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J. M. Rigg. Day 4, the 10th story. The wife of a leech, deeming her lover, who has taken an opiate, to be dead, puts him in a chest, which, with him therein, two usurers carry off to their house. He comes to himself, and is taken for a thief. But, the lady's maid giving the Signory to understand that she had put him in the chest, which the usurers stole, he escapes the gallows, and the usurers are mulcted in moneys for the theft of the chest.
Now that the king had told his tale, it only remained for Dioneo to do his part, which he witting, and being thereto bidden by the king, thus began.
Sore have I, to say naught of you, my ladies, been of iron and heart, to hear the woeful histories of ill-starred love, insomuch that I have desired of all things that they might have an end. Wherefore, now that, thank God, ended they are, unless I were minded, which God forbid, to add to such pernicious stuff a supplement of the like evil quality, no such dolorous theme do I purpose to ensue, but to make a fresh start with somewhat of a better and more cheerful sort, which perchance may serve to suggest to-morrow's argument. You are to know then, fairest my damsels, that 'tis not long since there dwelt at Salerno a leech most eminent in surgery. His name Master Mazzeo della Montagna, who in his extreme old age took to a wife a fair damsel of the same city, whom he kept in nobler and richer array of dresses and jewels, and all other finery that the sex affects, than any other lady in Salerno. Howbeit she was none too warm most of her time, being ill covered abed by the doctor, who gave her to understand, even as Messer Ricciardo de Cinzica, of whom we spoke a while since, taught his lady the feasts, that for once a man lay with a woman, he needed I know not how many days to recover, and the like nonsense, whereby she lived as ill content as might be, and lacking neither sense nor spirit, she determined to economise at home, and taking to the street, to live at others' expense. So, having passed in review divers young men, she at last found one that was to her mind, on whom she set all her heart and hopes of happiness, which the gallant perceiving was mightily flattered, and in like manner gave her all his love. Ruggiero de Gheroli, such was the gallant's name, was of noble birth, but of life and conversation so evil and reprehensible, that kinsman or friend he had none left that wished him well, or cared to see him, and all Salerno knew him for a common thief and rogue of the vilest character. Whereof the lady took little heed, having a mind to him for another reason, and so, with the help of her maid, she arranged a meeting with him. But after they had solaced themselves a while, the lady began to censure his past life, and to implore him for love of her to depart from such evil ways, and to afford him the means thereto, she from time to time furnished him with money. While thus with all discretion they continued their intercourse, it chanced that a man halt of one of his legs was placed under the leech's care. The leech saw what was amiss with him, and told his kinsfolk that unless a gangrened bone that he had in his leg were taken out, he must die, or have the whole leg amputated; that if the bone were removed he might recover, but that otherwise he would not answer for his life. Whereupon the relatives assented that the bone should be removed, and left the patient in the hands of the leech, who, deeming that by reason of the pain 'twas not possible for him to endure the treatment without an opiate, caused to be distilled in the morning a certain water of his own concoction, whereby the patient, drinking it, might be ensured sleep during such time as he deemed the operation, which he meant to perform about vespers, would occupy. In the meantime he had the water brought into his house, and set it in the window of his room, telling no one what it was. But when the vesper hour was come, and the leech was about to visit his patient, a messenger arrived from some very great friends of his at Amalfi, bearing tidings of a great riot there had been there, in which not a few had been wounded, and bidding him on no account to omit to hie him thither forthwith. Wherefore the leech put off the treatment of the leg to the morrow, and took boat to Amalfi; and the lady, knowing that he would not return home that night, did as she was wont in such a case, to wit, brought Ruggieri in privily, and locked him in her chamber until certain other folk that were in the house had gone to sleep. Ruggieri, then, being thus in the chamber awaiting the lady, and having, whether it was that he had a fatiguing day, or eaten something salt, or perchance that 'twas his habit of body, a mighty thirst, glancing at the window, caught sight of the bottle containing the water which the leech had prepared for the patient, and taking it to be drinking water, set it to his lips, and drank it all, and in no long time fell into a deep sleep. So soon as she was able, the lady hied her to the room, and there, finding Ruggieri asleep, touched him, and softly told him to get up. To no purpose, however; he neither answered nor stirred a limb. Wherefore the lady, rather losing patience, applied somewhat more force, and gave him a push, saying, "Get up, sleepy head; if thou hadst a mind to sleep, thou shouldst have gone home, and not have come hither." Thus pushed, Ruggieri fell down from a box on which he lay, and falling showed no more sign of animation than if he had been a corpse. The lady, now somewhat alarmed, essayed to lift him, and shook him roughly, and took him by the nose, and pulled him by the beard, again to no purpose. He had tethered his ass to a stout pin, so the lady began to fear he must be dead. However, she went on to pinch him shrewdly, and singe him with the flame of a candle. But when these methods also failed, she, being, for all she was a leech's wife, no leech herself, believed for sure that he was dead. And as there was naught in the world that she loved so much, it boots not to ask if she were sore distressed. Wherefore, silently, for she dared not lament aloud, she began to weep over him, and bewail such a misadventure. But after a while, fearing lest her loss should not be without sequel of shame, she bethought her that she must contrive without delay to get the body out of the house, and standing in need of another's advice, she quietly summoned her maid, showed her the mishap that had befallen her, and craved her counsel. Whereat the maid marvelled not a little, and she too fell to pulling Ruggieri this way and that, and pinching him, and, as she found no sign of life in him, concurred with her mistress that he was verily dead, and advised her to remove him from the house. "And where," said the lady, "shall we put him, that to-morrow, when he is discovered, it be not suspected that 'twas hence he was carried?" "Madam," answered the maid, "late last evening I marked in front of our neighbour the carpenter's shop a chest, not too large, which, if he have not put it back in the house, will come in very handy for our purpose, for we will put him inside, and give him 2 or 3 cuts with a knife, and so leave him. When he is found, I know not why it should be thought that 'twas from this house rather than from any other that he was put there. Nay, as he was an evil liver, 'twill be more likely supposed that, as he hied him on some evil errand, some enemy slew him, and then put him in the chest." The lady said that there was naught in the world she might so ill brook as that Ruggieri should receive any wound; but with that exception she approved her maid's proposal, and sent her to see if the chest was still where she had seen it. The maid, returning, reported that it was, and being young and strong, got Ruggieri, with the lady's help, upon her shoulders; and so the lady going before, to espy if any folk came that way, and the maid following, they came to the chest, and having laid Ruggieri therein, closed it, and left him there. Now, a few days before, 2 young men that were usurers had taken up their quarters in a house a little further on. They had seen the chest during the day, and being short of furniture, and having a mind to make great gain with little expenditure, they had resolved that if it was still there at night they would take it home with them. So at midnight forth they hied them, and finding the chest, were at no pains to examine it closely, but forthwith, though it seemed somewhat heavy, bore it off to their house, and set it down beside a room in which their women slept, and without being at pains to adjust it too securely, they left it there for the time, and went to bed. Towards matins, Ruggieri, having had a long sleep, and digested the draught, and exhausted its efficacy, awoke; but albeit his slumber was broken, and his senses had recovered their powers, yet his brain remained in a sort of torpor, which kept him bemused for some days; and when he opened his eyes, and saw nothing, and stretched his hands hither and thither, and found himself in the chest, it was with difficulty that he collected his thoughts. "How is this?" he said to himself. "Where am I? Do I sleep or wake? I remember coming this evening to my lady's chamber, and now it seems I am in a chest. What means it? Can the leech have returned, or somewhat else have happened that caused the lady, while I slept, to hide me here?" That was it, I suppose. Without a doubt it must have been so. And having come to this conclusion, he composed himself to listen, if haply he might hear something; and being somewhat ill at ease in the chest, which was none too large, and the side on which he lay paining him, he must needs turn over to the other, and did so with such adroitness that, bringing his loins smartly against one of the sides of the chest, which was set on an uneven floor, he caused it to tilt and then fall, and such was the noise it made as it fell that the women that slept there awoke, albeit for fear they kept silence. Ruggieri was not a little disconcerted by the fall, but, finding that thereby the chest was come open, he judged that, happen what might, he would be better out of it than in it; and not knowing where he was, and being otherwise at his wits' end, he began to grope about the house, if haply he might find a stair or door whereby he might take himself off. Hearing him thus groping his way, the alarmed women gave tongue with "Who is there?" Ruggieri, not knowing the voice, made no answer; wherefore the women fell to calling the 2 young men, who, having had a long day, were fast asleep, and heard naught of what went on, which served to increase the fright of the women, who rose and got them to divers windows, and raised the cry, "Take thief! Take thief!" at which summons there came running from divers quarters not a few of the neighbours, who got into the house by the roof, or otherwise, as each best might. Likewise the young men, aroused by the din, got up, and Ruggieri, being now all but beside himself for sheer amazement, and not knowing whither to turn him to escape them, they took him and delivered him to the officers of the governor of the city, who, hearing the uproar, had hasted to the spot. And so he was brought before the governor, who, knowing him to be held of all a most arrant evildoer, put him forthwith to the torture, and upon his confessing that he had entered the house of the usurers with intent to rob, was minded to make short work of it, and have him hanged by the neck. In the morning 'twas bruited throughout all Salerno that Ruggieri had been taken a thieving in the house of the usurers, whereat the lady and her maid were all amazement and bewilderment, insomuch that they were within an ace of persuading themselves that what they had done the night before they had not done, but had only dreamt it. Besides which, the peril in which Ruggieri stood caused the lady such anxiety as brought her to the verge of madness. Shortly after half tierce, the leech, being returned from Amalfi, and minded now to treat his patient, called for his water, and finding the bottle empty, made a great commotion, protesting that naught in his house could be left alone. The lady, having other cause of annoy, lost temper, and said, "What would you say, master, of an important matter, when you raise such a din because a bottle of water has been upset? Is there never another to be found in the world?" "Madam," replied the leech, "thou takest this to have been mere water. 'Twas no such thing, but an artificial water of a soporiferous virtue." And he told her for what purpose he had made it. Which the lady no sooner heard than, guessing that Ruggieri had drunk it, and so had seemed to them to be dead, she said, "Master, we know it not. Wherefore make you another?" And so the leech, seeing there was no help for it, had another made. Not long after, the maid, who by the lady's command had gone to find out what folk said of Ruggieri, returned, saying, "Madam, of Ruggieri they say naught but evil, nor, by what I have been able to discover, has he friend or kinsman that has or will come to his aid, and 'tis held for certain that tomorrow the Static will have him hanged. Besides which I have to tell you, which will surprise you, for methinks I have found out how he came into the usurer's house. List, then, how it was. You know the carpenter in front of whose shop stood the chest we put Ruggieri in? He had today the most violent altercation in the world with one to whom it would seem the chest belongs, by whom he was required to make good the value of the chest. To which he made answer that he had not sold it, but that it had been stolen from him in the night. 'Not so,' said the other. 'Thou sold it to the two usurers, as they themselves told me last night, when I saw it at their house at the time Ruggieri was taken.' 'They lie,' replied the carpenter. 'I never sold it to them, but they must have stolen it from me last night. Go we to them.' So with one accord off they went to the usurer's house, and I came back here. And so you see I make out that 'twas on such wise that Ruggieri was brought when he was found. But how he came to life again I am at a loss to conjecture." The lady now understood exactly how things were, and accordingly told the maid what she had learnt from the leech, and besought her to aid her to get Ruggieri off, for so she might, if she would, and at the same time preserve her honour. "Madam," said the maid, "do but show me how, and glad I shall be to do just as you wish." Whereupon the lady, to whom necessity taught invention, formed her plan on the spur of the moment, and expounded it in detail to the maid, who, as the first step, hied her to the leech, and weeping thus addressed him: "Sir, it behoves me to ask your pardon of a great wrong that I have done you." "And what may that be?" inquired the leech. "Sir," said the maid, who ceased not to weep, "you know what manner of man is Ruggieri de' Jeroli. Now he took a fancy to me, and partly for fear, partly for love, I this year agreed to be his mistress, and knowing yester eve that you were from home, he coaxed me into bringing him into your house to sleep with me in my room. Now he was athirst, and I, having no mind to be seen by your lady, who was in the hall, and knowing not whether I might sooner betake me for wine or water, bethought me that I had seen a bottle of water in your room, and ran and fetched it, and gave it to him to drink, and then put the bottle back in the place whence I had taken it, touching which I find that you have made a great stir in the house. Verily, I confess that I did wrong, But who is there that does not wrong sometimes? Sorry indeed am I to have so done, but 'tis not for such a cause, and that which ensued thereon, that Ruggieri should lose his life. Wherefore I do most earnestly beseech you pardon me, and suffer me to go help him as best I may be able." Wroth though he was at what he heard, the leech replied in a bantering tone, "Thy pardon thou hast by thine own deed. For whereas thou didst last night think to have with thee a gallant that would thoroughly dust thy pelisse for thee, he was but a sleepy head. Wherefore get thee gone, and do what thou mayest for the deliverance of thy lover, and for the future look thou bring him not into the house, else I will pay thee for that turn and this to boot." The maid, deeming that she had come off well in the first brush, hied her with all speed to the prison where Ruggieri lay, and by her cajoleries prevailed upon the warders to let her speak with him; and having told him how he must answer the static if he would get off, she succeeded in obtaining pre-audience of the static, who, seeing that the baggage was lusty and mettlesome, was minded, before he heard her, to grapple her with the hook, to which she was by no means averse, knowing that such a preliminary would secure her a better hearing. When she had undergone the operation and was risen, "Sir," said she, "you have here Ruggieri da Jeroli, apprehended on a charge of theft, which charge is false." Whereupon she told him the whole story from beginning to end, how she, being Ruggieri's mistress, had brought him into the leech's house, and had given him the opiate, not knowing it for such, and taking him to be dead, had put him in the chest. And then, recounting what she had heard pass between the carpenter and the owner of the chest, she showed him how Ruggieri came into the house of the usurers. Seeing that 'twas easy enough to find out whether the story were true, the static began by questioning the leech as to the water, and found that 'twas as she had said. He then summoned the carpenter, the owner of the chest, and the usurers, and after much further parley ascertained that the usurers had stolen the chest during the night and brought it into their house. Finally he sent for Ruggieri, and asked him where he had lodged that night. To which Ruggieri answered that where he had lodged he knew not, but he well remembered going to pass the night with Master Mazzeo's maid, in whose room he had drunk some water by reason of a great thirst that he had. But what happened to him afterwards, except that when he awoke he found himself in the chest in the house of the usurers, he knew not. All which matters the static heard with great interest, and caused the maid and Ruggieri and the carpenter and the usurers to rehearse them several times. In the end, seeing that Ruggieri was innocent, he released him, and mulcted the usurers in 15 ounces for the theft of the chest. How glad Ruggieri was thus to escape it boots not to ask, and glad beyond measure was his lady, and so many a time did they laugh and make merry together over the affair, she and he and the dear maid that had proposed to give him a taste of the knife, and remaining constant in their love, they had ever better and better solace thereof. The like whereof befalls me, sans the being put in the chest. End of Day 4, the 10th story.
Day 4. The conclusion of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by Rigg. Day the 4th. The conclusion. Heartsore as the gentle ladies had been made by the preceding stories, this last of Dioneo provoked them to such merriment, more especially the passage about the static on the hook, that they lacked not relief of the piteous mood engendered by the others. But the king observing that the sun was now taking a yellowish tinge, and that the end of his sovereignty was come, in terms most courtly made his excuse to the fair ladies, that he had made so direful a theme as lovers in felicity the topic of their discourse. After which he rose, took the laurel wreath from his head, and while the ladies watched to see to whom he would give it, set it graciously upon the blonde head of Fiammetta, saying, "Herewith I crown thee, as deeming that thou, better than any other, will know how to make tomorrow console our fair companions for the rude trials of today. Fiammetta, whose wavy tresses fell in a flood of gold over her white and delicate shoulders, whose softly rounded face was all radiant with the very tints of the white lily, blended with the red of the rose, who carried 2 eyes in her head that matched those of the peregrine falcon, while her tiny sweet mouth shewed a pair of lips that shone as rubies, replied with a smile, "And gladly take I the rest, Philostrato, and that thou mayst more truly understand what thou hast done, it is my present will and pleasure that each make ready to discourse tomorrow of good fortune befalling lovers after divers direful or disastrous adventures." The theme propounded was approved by all, whereupon the Queen called the Seneschal, and having made with him all the meet arrangements, rose and gaily dismissed all the company until the supper hour; wherefore, some straying about the garden, the beauties of which were not such as soon to pall, others bending their steps towards the mills that were grinding without, each as and where it seemed best, they took meanwhile their several pleasures. The supper hour come, they all gathered, in their wonted order, by the fair fountain, and in the gayest of spirits and well served they supped. Then, rising, they adversed them, as was their wont, to dance and song, and while Philomela led the dance, "Philostrato," said the Queen, "being minded to follow in the footsteps of our predecessors, and that as by their, so by our command a song be sung, and well witting that thy songs are even as thy stories, to the end that no day but this be vexed with thy misfortunes, we ordain that thou give us one of them, whichever thou mayst prefer." Philostrato answered that he would gladly do so, and without delay began to sing on this wise:
Full well my tears attest, O traitor love, with what just cause the heart, with which thou once hath broken faith, doth smart. Love, when thou first didst in my heart enshrine her for whom I still sigh, alas! in vain, nor any hope do know, a damsel so complete thou didst me show, that light as air I counted every pain, wherewith, behest of thine, condemned my soul to pine. Ah, but I gravely erred, the which to know, too late, alas! doth but enhance my woe. The cheat I knew not, ere she did leave me, she in whom alone my hopes were placed, for 'twas when I did most flatter myself with hope, and proudly boast myself her vassal lowliest and most graced, nor thought love might begrieve, nor dreamed he e'er might grieve. 'Twas then I found that she another's worth into her heart had taken, and cast me forth. A plant of pain, alas! my heart did bear, what time my hapless self cast forth I knew, and there it doth remain, and day and hour I curse and curse again. When first that front of love shone on my view, that front so queenly fair, and bright beyond compare, wherefore at once my faith, my hope, my fire, my soul doth imprecate, ere she expire. My lord, thou knowest how comfortless my woe. Thou, love, my lord, whom thus I supplicate, with many a piteous groan, telling thee how I anguish, sore I groan, yearning for death my pain to mitigate. Come, death, and with one blow cut short my span, and so, with my cursed life, me of my frenzy ease, for wheresoever I go, 'twill sure decrease. Save death, no way of comfort doth remain, no anodyne beside for this sore smart. The boon then, love bestow, and presently by death annul my woe, and from this abject life release my heart, since from me joy is ta'en, and every solace ta'en. My prayer to grant, and let my death the cheer complete that she now hath of her new fare. Song, it may be that no one shall thee learn, nor do I care, for none I wot so well, as I may chant thee so. This one behest I lay upon thee, go. Hie thee to love, and him in secret tell How I my life do spurn, my bitter life, and yearn, That to a better harborage he bring Me of all might and grace that owe him king. Full well my tears attest.
Philostratus' mood and its cause were made abundantly manifest by the words of this song, and perchance they had been made still more so by the looks of a lady that was among the dancers, had not the shades of night, which had now overtaken them, concealed the blush that suffused her face. Other songs followed until the hour for slumber arrived, whereupon, at the behest of the Queen, all the ladies sought their several chambers. End of Day 4. The conclusion. Day the 5th. The introduction of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by M. Rigg. Day the 5th. The introduction. Endeth here the 4th day of the Decameron, beginneth the 5th, in which, under the rule of Fiammetta, discourse is had of good fortune befalling lovers after divers direful or disastrous adventures. All the east was white, nor any part of our hemisphere unillumined by the rising beams, when the carolling of the birds that in a gay chorus saluted the dawn among the baths induced Fiammetta to rise, and rose the other ladies and the three gallants, with whom adown the hill and about the dewy meads of the broad champaign she sauntered, talking gaily of divers matters, until the sun had attained some height; then, feeling his rays grow somewhat scorching, they retraced their steps and returned to the villa, where, having repaired their slight fatigue with excellent wines and comfits, they took their pastime in the pleasant garden until the breakfast hour, when, all things being made ready by the discreet seneschal, they, after singing a stampita and a balladette or two, gaily at the queen's behest, sat them down to eat. Meetly ordered and gladsome was the meal, which done, heedful of their rule of dancing, they trod a few short measures with accompaniment of music and song. Thereupon, being all dismissed by the queen until after the siesta, some hied them to rest, while others tarried taking their pleasure in the fair garden. But shortly after noon, all at the queen's behest reassembled, according to their wont, by the fountain, and the queen, having seated herself on her throne, glanced towards Pamphilo, and bade him, with a smile, lead off with the stories of good fortune. Whereto Pamphilo gladly asserted himself, and thus began. End of introduction of the Day 5.
Day 5. The first story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eugene Smith. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by J. M. Rigg. Day 5, the first story. Cimon, by loving, waxes wise, wins his wife Iphigenia by capture on the high seas, and is imprisoned at Rhodes. He is delivered by Lysimachus, and the twain capture Cassandra and recapture Iphigenia in the hour of their marriage. They flee with their ladies to Crete, and having there married them, are brought back to their homes. Many stories, sweet my ladies, occur to me as meet for me to tell by way of ushering in a day so joyous as this will be, of which one does most commend itself to my mind, because not only has it one of those happy endings of which today we are in quest, but 'twill enable you to understand how wholly how mighty and how salutary are the forces of love, which not a few, witting not what they say, do most unjustly reprobate and reviled, which, if I err not, should to you, for that I take you to be enamoured, be indeed welcome. Once upon a time, then, as we have read in the ancient histories of the Cypriots, there was in the island of Cyprus a very great noble named Aristippus, a man rich in all worldly goods beyond all other of his countrymen, and who might have deemed himself incomparably blessed, but for a single sore affliction that fortune had allotted him, which was that among his sons he had one, the best grown and handsomest of them all, that was well nigh a hopeless imbecile. His true name was Galenus, but as neither his tutor's pains, nor his father's coaxing or chastisement, nor any other method, had availed to imbue him with any tincture of letters or manners, but he still remained gruff and savage of voice, and in his bearing liker to a beast than to a man, all, as in derision, were wont to call him Cimon, which in their language signifies the same as bestione, brute, in ours. The father, grieved beyond measure to see his son's life thus blighted, and having abandoned all hope of his recovery, nor caring to have the cause of his mortification ever before his eyes, bade him betake him to the farm, and there keep with his husbandmen. To Cimon the change was very welcome, because the manners and habits of the uncouth hinds were more to his taste than those of the citizens. So to the farm Cimon hied him, and addressed himself to the work thereof. And being thus employed, he chanced one afternoon, as he passed, staff on shoulder, from one domain to another, to enter a plantation, the like of which for beauty there was not in those parts, and which was then, for 'twas the month of May, a mass of greenery. And as he traversed it, he came, as fortune was pleased to guide him, to a meadow girt in with trees exceeding tall, and having in one of its corners a fountain most fair and cool, beside which he espied a most beautiful girl, lying asleep on the green grass, clad only in a vest of such fine stuff that it scarce in any measure veiled the whiteness of her flesh, and below the waist naught but an apron most white and fine of texture, and likewise at her feet there slept 2 women and a man, her slaves. No sooner did Cimon catch sight of her, than, as if he had never before seen form of woman, he stopped short, and leaning on his cudgel, regarded her intently, saying never a word, and lost in admiration. And in his rude soul, which, despite 1,000 lessons, had hitherto remained impervious to every delight that belongs to urbane life, he felt the awakening of an idea, that bade his gross and coarse mind acknowledge that this girl was the fairest creature that had ever been seen by mortal eye. And thereupon he began to distinguish her several parts, praising her hair, which showed to him as gold, her brow, her nose and mouth, her throat and arms, and above all her bosom, which was as yet but in bud. And as he gazed, he changed of a sudden from a husbandman into a judge of beauty, and desired of all things to see her eyes, which the weight of her deep slumber kept close shut, and many a time he would fain have awakened her, that he might see them. But so much fairer seemed she to him than any other woman that he had seen, that he doubted she must be a goddess, and he was not so devoid of sense but that he deemed things divine more worthy of reverence than things mundane. He forbore, and waited until she should wake of her own accord, and though he found the delay overlong, yet, enthralled by so unwonted a delight, he knew not how to be going. However, after he had tarried a long while, it so befell that Iphigenia, such was the girl's name, her slaves still sleeping, awoke, and raised her head, and opened her eyes, and seeing Cimon standing before her, leaning on his staff, was not a little surprised, and said, "Cimon, what seekest thou in this wood at this hour?" For Cimon she knew well, as indeed did almost all in the countryside, by reason alike of his uncouth appearance as of the rank and wealth of his father. To Iphigenia's question he answered never a word, but as soon as her eyes were open, naught could he do but intently regard them, for it seemed to him that a soft influence emanated from them, which filled his soul with a delight that he had never before known; which the girl marking, began to misdoubt that by so fixed a scrutiny his boorish temper might be prompted to some act that should cause her dishonour. Wherefore she roused her women, and got up, saying, "Keep thy distance, Cimon, in God's name." Whereto Cimon made answer, "I will come with thee." And albeit the girl refused his escort, being still in fear of him, she could not get quit of him. But he attended her home, after which she hied him straight to his father's house, and announced that he was minded on no account to go back to the farm, which intelligence was far from welcome to his father and kinsmen, but nevertheless they suffered him to stay, and waited to see what might be the reason of his change of mind. So Cimon, whose heart, closed to all teaching, love's shaft, sped by the beauty of Iphigenia, had penetrated, did now graduate in wisdom with such celerity as to astonish his father and kinsmen, and all that knew him. He began by requesting his father to let him go clad in the like apparel, and with, in all respects, the like personal equipment as his brothers, which his father very gladly did. Mixing thus with the gallants, and becoming familiar with the manners proper to gentlemen, and especially to lovers, he very soon, to the exceeding great wonder of all, not only acquired the rudiments of letters, but waxed most eminent among the philosophic wits. After which, for no other cause than the love he bore to Iphigenia, he not only modulated his gruff and boorish voice to a degree of smoothness suitable to urbane life, but made himself accomplished in singing and music. In riding also, and in all matters belonging to war, as well by sea as by land, he waxed most expert and hardy. And in sum, that I go not about to enumerate each of his virtues in detail, he had not completed the 4th year from the stay of his first becoming enamoured, before he was grown the most gallant and courteous, aye, and the most perfect in particular accomplishments, of the young cavaliers that were in the island of Cyprus. What then, gracious ladies, are we to say of Cimon? Verily, naught else but that the high faculties with which heaven had endowed his noble soul, invidious fortune had bound with the strongest of cords, and circumscribed within a very narrow region of his heart. All which cords love, more potent than fortune, burst and break in pieces, and then, with the might wherewith he wakens dormant powers, he brought them forth of the cruel obfuscation in which they lay, into clear light, plainly showing thereby whence he may withdraw, and whither he may guide, by his beams the souls that are subject to his sway. Now, albeit by his love for Iphigenia Cimon was betrayed, as young lovers very frequently are, into some peccadilloes, yet Aristippus, reflecting that it had turned him from a booby into a man, not only bore patiently with him, but exhorted him with all his heart to continue steadfast in his love. And Cimon, who still refused to be called Galesus, because 'twas as Cimon that Iphigenia had first addressed him, being desirous to accomplish his desire by honourable means, did many a time urge his suit upon her father, Chipsius, that he would give her him to wife. Whereto Chipsius always made the same answer, to wit, that he had promised her to Pasimondas, a young Rhodian noble, and was not minded to break faith with him. However, the time appointed for Iphigenia's wedding being come, and the bridegroom having sent for her, Cimon said to himself, "'Tis now for me to show thee, Iphigenia, how great is my love for thee. 'Tis by thee that I am grown a man, Nor doubt I, if I shall have thee, that I shall wax more glorious than a god, and verily thee I will have, or die. Having so said, he privily enlisted in his cause certain young nobles that were his friends, and secretly fitted out a ship with all equipment meet for combat, and put to sea on the lookout for the ship that was to bear Iphigenia to Rhodes and her husband. And at length, when her father had done lavishing honours upon her husband's friends, Iphigenia embarked, and the mariners, shaping their course for Rhodes, put to sea. Cimon was on the alert, and overhauled them the very next day, and standing on his ship's prow, shouted amain to those that were aboard Iphigenia's ship, "Bring to, strike sails, or look to be conquered and sunk in the sea." Then, seeing that the enemy had gotten their arms above deck, and were making ready to make a fight of it, he followed up his words by casting a grapnel upon the poop of the Rhodians, who were making great way, and having thus made their poop fast to his prow, he sprang, fierce as a lion, reckless whether he were followed or no, onto the Rhodian ship, making, as it were, no account of them, and animated by love, hurled himself, sword in hand, with prodigious force among the enemy, and cutting and thrusting right and left, slaughtered them like sheep. Insomuch that the Rhodians, marking the fury of his onset, threw down their arms, and as with one voice did all acknowledge themselves his prisoners. To whom Cimon, "Gallants," quoth he, "'twas neither lust or beauty nor enmity to you that caused me to put out from Cyprus to attack you here with force of arms on the high seas. Moved was I thereto by that which to gain is to me a matter great indeed, which peaceably to yield me is to you but a slight matter. For 'tis even Iphigenia, whom more than aught else I love, whom, as I might not have her of her father in peaceable and friendly sort, love has constrained me to take from you in this high-handed fashion, and by force of arms, to whom I mean to be even such as would have been your Pasamondus. Wherefore give her to me, and go your way, and God's grace go with you." Yielding rather to force than prompted by generosity, the Rhodians surrendered Iphigenia, all tears, to Cimon, who, marking her tears, said to her, "Grieve not, noble lady, thy Cimon am I, who, by my long love, have established a far better right to thee than Pasamondus by the faith that was plighted to him." So saying, he sent her aboard his ship, whither he followed her, touching naught that belonged to the Rhodians, and suffering them to go their way. To have gotten so dear a prize made him the happiest man in the world, but for a time 'twas all he could do to assuage her grief. Then, after taking counsel with his comrades, he deemed it best not to return to Cyprus for the present, and so, by common consent, they shaped their course for Crete, where most of them, and especially Cimon, had alliances of old or recent date, and friends not a few, whereby they deemed that they might tarry with Iphigenia in security. But fortune, that had accorded Cimon so gladsome a capture of the lady, suddenly proved fickle, and converted the boundless joy of the enamoured gallant into woeful and bitter lamentation. 'Twas not yet full 4 hours since Cimon had parted from the Rhodians, when, with the approach of night, that night from which Cimon hoped such joyance as he had never known, came weather most turbulent and tempestuous, which wrapped the heavens in cloud and swept the sea with scathing blasts, whereby 'twas not possible for any to see how the ship was to be worked or steered, or to steady himself so as to do any duty upon her deck. Whereat what grief was Cimon's it boots not to ask. Indeed, it seemed to him that the gods had granted his heart's desire only that it might be harder for him to die, which had else been to him but a light matter. Not less downcast were his comrades, but most of all Iphigenia, who, weeping bitterly and shuddering at every wave that struck the ship, did cruelly curse Cimon's love, and censure his rashness, averring that this tempest was come upon them for no other cause than that the gods had decreed that, as 'twas in despite of their will that he purposed to espouse her, he should be frustrate of his presumptuous intent, and having lived to see her expire, should then himself meet a woeful death. While thus, and yet more bitterly, they bewailed them, and the mariners were at their wits' end, as the gale grew hourly more violent, nor knew they, nor might conjecture, whither they went, they drew nigh the island of Rhodes, albeit that Rhodes it was they wist not, and set themselves, as best and most skilfully they might, to run the ship aground. In which enterprise fortune favoured them, bringing them into a little bay, where shortly before them was arrived the Rhodian ship that Cimon had let go. Nor were they sooner aware that 'twas Rhodes they had made, than day broke, and the sky thus brightening a little, they saw that they were about a bow shot from the ship that they had released on the preceding day. Whereupon Cimon, vexed beyond measure, being apprehensive of that which in fact befell them, bade make every effort to win out of the bay, and let fortune carry them whither she would, for nowhere might they be in worse plight than there. So might and main they strove to bring the ship out, but all in vain. The violence of the gale thwarted them to such purpose as not only to preclude their passage out of the bay, but to drive them, willing-nilling, ashore, whither no sooner were they come than they were recognized by the Rhodian mariners who had already landed, of whom one ran with all speed to a farm hard by, whither the Rhodian gallants were gone, and told them that fortune had brought Cimon and Iphigenia aboard their ship into the same bay to which she had guided them. Whereat the gallants were overjoyed, and taking with them not a few of the farm servants, hied them in hot haste to the shore, where, Cimon and his men being already landed with intent to take refuge in a neighbouring wood, they took them all, with Iphigenia, and brought them to the farm. Whence, pursuant to an order of the Senate of Rhodes, to which, so soon as he received the news, Pasimondus made his complaint, Cimon and his men were all marched off to prison by Lysimachus, chief magistrate of the Rhodians for that year, who came down from the city for the purpose with an exceeding great company of men-at-arms. On such wise did our hapless and enamoured Cimon lose his so lately won Iphigenia, before he had had of her more than a kiss or two. Iphigenia was entertained and comforted of the annoy, occasioned as well by her recent capture as by fury of the sea, by not a few noble ladies of Rhodes, with whom she tarried until the day appointed for her marriage. In recompense of the release of the Rhodian gallants on the preceding day, the lives of Cimon and his men were spared, notwithstanding that Pasimondus pressed might and main for their execution, and instead they were condemned to perpetual imprisonment, wherein, as may be supposed, they abode in dolorous plight, and despaired of ever again knowing happiness. However, it so befell that, Pasimondus accelerating his nuptials to the best of his power, fortune, as if repenting her that in her haste she had done Cimon so evil a turn, did now by a fresh disposition of events compass his deliverance. Pasimondus had a brother, by name Hormisdas, his equal in all respects save in years, who had long been contract to marry Cassandra, a fair and noble damsel of Rhodes, of whom Lysimachus was in the last degree enamoured. But owing to divers accidents, the marriage had been from time to time put off. Now Pasimondus, being about to celebrate his nuptials with exceeding great pomp, bethought him that he could do no better than, to avoid a repetition of the pomp and expense, arrange, if so he might, that his brother should be wedded on the same day with himself. So, having consulted anew with Cassandra's kinsfolk, and come to an understanding with them, he and his brother and they conferred together, and agreed that on the same day that Pasimondus married Iphigenia, Hormisdas should marry Cassandra. Lysimachus, getting wind of this arrangement, was mortified beyond measure, seeing himself thereby deprived of the hope which he cherished of marrying Cassandra himself, if Hormisdas should not forestall him. But like a wise man he concealed his chagrin, and cast about how he might frustrate the arrangement, to which end he saw no other possible means but to carry Cassandra off. It did not escape him that the office which he held would render this easily feasible, but he deemed it all the more dishonourable than if he had not held the office. But, in short, after much pondering, honour yielded place to love, and he made up his mind that, come what might, he would carry Cassandra off. Then, as he took thought what company he should take with him, and how he should go about the affair, he remembered Cimon, whom he had in prison with his men, and it occurred to him that he could not possibly have a better or more trusty associate in such an enterprise than Cimon. Wherefore, the same night, he caused Cimon to be brought privily to him in his own room, and thus addressed him: "Cimon, as the gods are most generous and liberal to bestow their gifts on men, so are they also most sagacious to try their virtue, and those whom they find to be firm and steadfast in all circumstances they honour as the most worthy with the highest rewards. They have been minded to be certified of thy worth by better proofs than thou couldst afford them, as long as thy life was bounded by thy father's house amid the superabundant wealth which I know him to possess. Wherefore, in the first place, they so wrought upon thee with the shrewd incitements of love, that from an insensate brute, as I have heard, thou grewest to be a man. Since when it has been, and is their intent, to try whether evil fortune and harsh imprisonment may avail to change thee from the temper that was thine, when for a short while thou hadst joyance of the prize thou hadst won. And so thou prove the same that thou wast then, they have in store for thee a boon incomparably greater than aught that they vouchsafed thee before. What that boon is, to the end thou mayst recover heart and thy wonted energies, I will now explain to thee. Ghismonda, exultant in thy misfortune, and eager to compass thy death, hastens to the best of his power his nuptials with thy Iphigenia, that so may he enjoy the prize that fortune, erstwhile smiling, gave thee, and forthwith, frowning, reft from thee. Whereat how sore must be thy grief, if rightly I gauge thy love, I know by my own case, seeing that his brother Hormisdas addresses himself to do me on the same day a like wrong in regard of Cassandra, whom I love more than aught else in the world. Nor see I that fortune has left us any way of escape from this her unjust and cruel spite, save what we may make for ourselves by a resolved spirit and the might of our right hands. Take we then the sword, and therewith make we each prize of his lady, thou for the second, I for the first time. For so thou value the recovery, I say not of thy liberty, for without thy lady I doubt thou wouldst hold it cheap, but of thy lady the gods have placed it in thine own hands, if thou art but minded to join me in my enterprise." These words restored to Cimon all that he had lost of heart and hope, nor pondered he long before he replied: "Lysimachus, comrade stouter or more staunch than I thou mightest not have in such an enterprise, if such indeed is be as thou sayest. Wherefore lay upon me such behest as thou shalt deem meet, and thou shalt marvel to witness the vigour of my performance." Whereupon Lysimachus: "On the third day from now," quoth he, "their husbands' houses will be newly entered by the brides, and on the same day, at even, we too will enter them in arms, thou with thy men, and I with some of mine, in whom I place great trust. And forcing our way among the guests and slaughtering all that dare to oppose us, will bear the ladies off to a ship which I have had privily got ready." Cimon approved the plan, and kept quiet in prison until the appointed time, which being come, the nuptials were celebrated with great pomp and magnificence that filled the houses of the two brothers with festal cheer. Then Lysimachus, having made ready all things meet, and fired Cimon and his men and his own friends for the enterprise by a long harangue, disposed them in due time, all bearing arms under their cloaks, in 3 companies. And having privily dispatched one company to the port, that when the time should come to embark he might meet with no let, he marched with the other 2 companies to the house of Pazimondas, posted the one company at the gate, that being entered they might not be shut in or debarred their egress, and with the other company and Cimon ascended the stairs, and gained the saloon, where the brides and not a few other ladies were set at several tables to sup in meet order. Whereupon in they rushed, and overthrew the tables, and seized each his own lady, and placed them in charge of their men, whom they bade bear them off forthwith to the ship that lay ready to receive them. Whereupon the brides and the other ladies and the servants, with one accord, fell a sobbing and shrieking, insomuch that a confused din and lamentation filled the whole place. Cimon, Lysimachus, and their band, none withstanding, but all giving way before them, gained the stairs, which they were already descending when they encountered Pazimondas, who, carrying a great staff in his hand, was making in the direction of the noise. But one doughty stroke of Cimon's sword sufficed to cleave his skull in twain, and lay him dead at Cimon's feet. And another stroke disposed of hapless Hormisdas, as he came running to his brother's aid. Some others who ventured to approach them were wounded and beaten off by the retinue. So forth of the house, that reeked with blood and resounded with tumult and lamentation and woe, sped Cimon and Lysimachus with all their company, and without any let, in close order, with their fair booty in their midst, made good their retreat to the ship. Whereon with the ladies they one and all embarked, for the shore was now full of armed men come to rescue the ladies, and the oarsmen, giving way, put to sea elate. Arrived at Crete, they met with a hearty welcome on the part of their many friends and kinsfolk, and having married their ladies, they made greatly merry, and had gladsome joyance of their fair booty. Their doings occasioned, both in Cyprus and in Rhodes, no small stir and commotion, which lasted for a long while. But in the end, by the good offices of their friends and kinsfolk in both islands, 'twas so ordered as that after a certain term of exile, Cimon returned with Iphigenia to Cyprus, and in like manner Lysimachus returned with Cassandra to Rhodes. And long and blithely thereafter lived they, each well contented with his own wife in his own land. End of Day 5, the first story.
The second story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5, the second story. Costanza loves Martuccio Gomito, and hearing that he is dead, gives way to despair, and hies her alone aboard a boat, which is wafted by the wind to Susa. She finds him alive in Tunis, and makes herself known to him, who, having by his counsel gained high place in the king's favour, marries her, and returns with her wealthy to Lipari.
Pamphilo's story being ended, the queen, after commending it not a little, called for one to follow from Emilia, who thus began.
Meet and right it is that one should rejoice when events so fall out that passion meets with its due reward, and as love merits in the long run rather joy than suffering, far gladlier obey I the queen's than I did the king's behest, and address myself to our present theme. You are to know then, dainty ladies, that not far from Sicily there is an islet called Lipari, in which, no great while ago, there dwelt a damsel, Costanza by name, fair as fair could be, and of one of the most honourable families in the island. And one Martuccio Gomito, who was also of the island, a young man most gallant and courteous, and worthy for his condition, became enamoured of Costanza, who in like manner grew so afire for him that he was ever ill at ease except she saw him. Martuccio, craving her to wife, asked her of her father, who made answer that, Martuccio being poor, he was not minded to give her to him. Mortified to be thus rejected by reason of poverty, Martuccio took an oath in presence of some of his friends and kinsfolk that Leparo should know him no more until he was wealthy. So away he sailed, and took to scouring the seas as a rover on the coast of Barbary, preying upon all whose force matched not his own. In which way of life he found fortune favourable enough, had he but known how to rest and be thankful. But 'twas not enough that he and his comrades in no long time waxed very wealthy. Their covetousness was inordinate, and, while they sought to gratify it, they chanced in an encounter with certain Saracen ships to be taken after a long defence, and despoiled, and, most part of them, thrown into the sea by their captors, who, after sinking his ship, took Martuccio with them to Tunis, and clapped him in prison, and there kept him a long time in a very sad plight. Meanwhile, not by one or two, but by divers and not a few persons, tidings reached Lipari that all that were with Martuccio aboard his bark had perished in the sea. The damsel, whose grief on Martuccio's departure had known no bounds, now hearing that he was dead with the rest, wept a great while, and made up her mind to have done with life. But, lacking the resolution to lay violent hands upon herself, she bethought her how she might devote herself to death by some novel expedient. So one night she stole out of her father's house, and hied her to the port, and there by chance she found, lying a little apart from the other craft, a fishing boat, which, as the owners had but just quitted her, was still equipped with mast and sails and oars. Aboard which boat she forthwith got, and being, like most of the women of the island, not altogether without nautical skill, she rowed some distance out to sea, and then hoisted sail, and cast away oars and tiller, and let the boat drift, deeming that a boat without lading or steersman would certainly be either capsized by the wind, or dashed against some rock and broken in pieces, so that escape she could not, even if she would, but must perforce drown. And so, her head wrapped in a mantle, she stretched herself weeping on the floor of the boat. But it fell out quite otherwise than she had conjectured, for, the wind being from the north and very equable, with next to no sea, the boat kept an even keel, and next day about vespers bore her to land hard by a city called Susa, full 100 miles beyond Tunis. To the damsel 'twas all one whether she were at sea or ashore, for since she had been aboard she had never once raised, nor, come what might, meant she ever to raise, her head. Now it so chanced that when the boat grounded there was on the shore a poor woman that was in the employ of some fishermen, whose nets she was just taking out of the sunlight. Seeing the boat under full sail, she marvelled how it should be suffered to drive ashore, and conjectured that the fishermen on board were asleep. So to the boat she hied her, and finding therein only the damsel fast asleep, she called her many times, and at length awakened her. And perceiving by her dress that she was a Christian, she asked her in Latin how it was that she was come thither all alone in the boat. Hearing the Latin speech, the damsel wondered whether the wind had not shifted and carried her back to Lipari. So up she started, gazed about her, and finding herself ashore and the aspect of the country strange, asked the good woman where she was. To which the good woman made answer, "My daughter, thou art hard by Susa in Barbary." Whereupon the damsel, sorrowful that God had not seen fit to accord her the boon of death, apprehensive of dishonour, and at her wits' end, sat herself down at the foot of her boat and burst into tears. Which the good woman saw not without pity, and persuaded her to come with her into her hut, and there by coaxing drew from her how she was come thither, and knowing that she could not but be fasting, she set before her her own coarse bread and some fish and water, and prevailed upon her to eat a little. Costanza thereupon asked her who she was that thus spoke Latin, whereto she answered that her name was Carapresa, and that she was from Trapani, where she had served some Christian fishermen. To the damsel, sad indeed though she was, this name Carapresa, wherefore she knew not, seemed to be of happy augury, so that she began to take hope, she knew not why, and to grow somewhat less fain of death. Wherefore, without disclosing who or whence she was, she earnestly besought the good woman for the love of God to have pity on her youth, and advise her how best to avoid insult. Whereupon Carapresa, good woman that she was, left her in her hut, while with all speed she picked up her nets, and on her return she wrapped her in her own mantle and led her to Susa. Arrived there, she said to her, "Costanza, I shall bring thee to the house of an excellent Saracen lady, for whom I frequently do bits of work, as she has occasion. She is an old lady and compassionate. I will commend thee to her care as best I may, and I doubt not she will right gladly receive thee, and entreat thee as her daughter. And thou wilt serve her, and, while thou art with her, do all thou canst to gain her favour, until such time as God may send thee better fortune." And as she said, so she did. The old lady listened, and then, gazing steadfastly in the damsel's face, shed tears, and taking her hand, kissed her forehead, and led her into the house, where she and some other women dwelt quite by themselves, doing divers kinds of handiwork in silk and palm leaves and leather; wherein the damsel in a few days acquired some skill, and thenceforth wrought together with them, and rose wondrous high in the favour and good graces of all the ladies, who soon taught her their language. Now while the damsel, mourned at home as lost and dead, dwelt thus at Susa, it so befell that, Mariabdella being then king of Tunis, a young chieftain in Granada, of great power, and backed by mighty allies, gave out that the realm of Tunis belonged to him, and having gathered a vast army, made a descent upon Tunis with intent to expel the king from the realm. Matuccio Gomito, who knew the language of Barbary well, heard the tidings in prison, and learning that the king of Tunis was mustering a mighty host for the defence of his kingdom, said to one of the warders that were in charge of him and his comrades, "If I might have speech of the king, I am confident that the advice that I should give him would secure him the victory." The warder repeated these words to his chief, who forthwith carried them to the king. Wherefore by the king's command Martuccio was brought before him, and being asked by him what the advice of which had spoken might be, answered on this wise: "Sire, if in old days, when I was wont to visit this country of yours, I duly observed the manner in which you order your battle, methinks you place your main reliance upon archers; and therefore, if you could contrive that your enemy's supply of arrows should give out, and your own continue plentiful, I apprehend that you would win the battle." "Ay, indeed," replied the king, "I make no doubt that, could I but accomplish that, I should conquer." "Nay, but sire," returned Matuccio, "you may do it, if you will. Listen, and I will tell you how. You must fit the bows of your archers with strings much finer than those that are in common use, and match them with arrows the notches of which will not admit any but these fine strings, and this you must do so secretly that your enemy may not know it, else he will find means to be even with you. Which counsel I give you for the following reason: when your and your enemy's archers have expended all their arrows, you wot that the enemy will fall to picking up the arrows that your men have shot during the battle, and your men will do the like by the enemy's arrows; but the enemy will not be able to make use of your men's arrows, by reason that their fine notches will not suffice to admit the stout strings, whereas your men will be in the contrary case in regard of the enemy's arrows, for the fine string will very well receive the large notched arrow. And so your men will have an abundant supply of arrows, while the enemy will be at a loss for them." The king, who lacked not sagacity, appreciated Martuccio's advice, and gave full effect to it, whereby he came out of the war a conqueror, and Martuccio, being raised to the chief place in his favour, waxed rich and powerful. Which matters being bruited throughout the country, it came to the ears of Costanza that Matuccio Gomito, whom she had long supposed to be dead, was alive, whereby her love for him, some embers of which still lurked in her heart, burst forth again in sudden flame, and gathered strength, and revived her dead hope. Wherefore she frankly told all her case to the good lady with whom she dwelt, saying that she would fain go to Tunis, that her eyes might have assurance of that which the report received by her ears had made them yearn to see. The lady fell heartily in with the girl's desire, and, as if she had been her mother, embarked with her for Tunis, where on their arrival they were honourably received in the house of one of her kinswomen. Carapresa, who had attended her, being sent to discover what she might touching Matuccio, brought back word that he was alive, and high in honour and place. The gentlewoman was minded that none but herself should apprise Martuccio of the arrival of his Costanza, wherefore she hied her one day to Martuccio, and said, "Martuccio, there is come to my house a servant of thine from Lipari, who would fain speak with thee here privily, and for that he would not have me trust another, I am come hither myself to deliver his message." Martuccio thanked her, and forthwith hied him with her to her house. Where no sooner did the girl see him than she all but died for joy, and carried away by her feelings, fell upon his neck with open arms and embraced him; and, what with sorrow of his past woes and her present happiness, said never a word, but softly wept. Matuccio regarded her for a while in silent wonder; then Heaving a sigh, he said, "Thou livest then, my Costanza. Long since I heard that thou wast lost, nor was aught known of thee at home." Which said, he tenderly and with tears embraced her. Costanza told him all her adventures, and how honourably she had been entreated by the gentlewoman with whom she had dwelt. And so long time they conversed, and then Martuccio parted from her, and hied him back to his lord the king, and told him all, to wit, his own adventures and those of the girl, adding that with his leave he was minded to marry her according to our law. Which matters the king found passing strange, and having called the girl to him, and learned from her that 'twas even as Martuccio had said, "Well indeed," quoth he, "hast thou won thy husband." Then caused he gifts most ample and excellent to be brought forth, part of which he gave to Costanza and part to Martuccio, leaving them entirely to their own devices in regard of one another. Then Martuccio, in terms most honourable, bade farewell to the old lady with whom Costanza had dwelt, thanking her for the service she had rendered to Costanza, and giving her presents suited to her condition, and commending her to God, while Costanza shed many a tear. After which, by leave of the king, they went aboard a light bark, taking with them Carapresa, and, sped by a prosperous breeze, arrived at Lipari, where they were received with such cheer as 'twere vain to attempt to describe. There were Martuccio and Costanza wedded with all pomp and splendour, and there long time in easeful peace they had joyance of their love. End of Day 5, the second story.
Day 5, the third story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5, the third story. Pietro Boccamazza runs away with Agnolella and encounters a gang of robbers. The girl takes refuge in a wood and is guided to a castle. Pietro is taken but escapes out of the hands of the robbers, and after some adventures arrives at the castle where Agnolella is, marries her, and returns with her to Rome.
Ended Emilia's story, which none of the company spared to commend. The queen, turning to Elisa, bade her follow suit, and she, with glad obedience, thus began.
'Tis a story sweet, ladies, of a woeful night passed by two indiscreet young lovers that I have in mind, but as thereon ensued not a few days of joy, 'tis not in opposite to our argument, and shall be narrated. 'Tis no long time since at Rome, which albeit now the tale was of yore the head of the world, there dwelt a young man, Pietro Boccamazza by name, a scion of one of the most illustrious of the Roman houses, who became enamoured of a damsel exceeding fair, and amorous withal, her name Agnolella, the daughter of one Gigliuzzo Saulo, a plebeian, but in high repute among the Romans. Nor loving thus did Pietro lack the address to inspire in Agnolella a love as ardent as his own. Wherefore, overmastered by his passion, and minded no longer to endure the sore suffering that it caused him, he asked her in marriage. Whereof his kinsfolk were no sooner apprised, than with one accord they came to him, and strongly urged him to desist from his purpose. They also gave Gigliuzzo Saulo to understand that he were best to pay no sort of heed to Pietro's words, for that if he so did, they would never acknowledge him as friend or relative. Thus, to see himself debarred of the one way by which he deemed he might attain to his desire, Pietro was ready to die for grief, and, all his kinsfolk notwithstanding, he would have married Gigliuzzo's daughter, had but the father consented. Wherefore at length he made up his mind that if the girl were willing, naught should stand in the way, and having through a common friend sounded the damsel, and found her apt, he brought her to consent to elope with him from Rome. The affair being arranged, Pietro and she took horse betimes one morning, and sallied forth for Anagni, where Pietro had certain friends in whom he placed much trust; and as they rode, time not serving for full joyance of their love, for they feared pursuit, they held converse thereof, and from time to time exchanged a kiss. Now it so befell that the way being none too well known to Pietro, when perhaps 8 miles from Rome they should have turned to the right, they took instead a leftward road. Whereon, when they had ridden but little more than 2 miles, they found themselves close to a petty castle, whence, so soon as they were observed, there issued some dozen men at arms. And as they drew near, the damsel, espying them, gave a cry, and said, "We are attacked, Pietro, let us flee." And guiding her nag as best she knew towards a great forest, she planted the spurs in his sides, and so, holding on by the saddle bow, was borne by the goaded creature into the forest at a gallop. Pietro, who had been too engrossed with her face to give due heed to the way, and thus had not been aware, as soon as she, of the approach of the men at arms, was still looking about to see whence they were coming, when they came upon him, and took him prisoner, and forced him to dismount. Then they asked who he was, and when he told them, they conferred among themselves, saying, "This is one of the friends of our enemies. What else can we do but relieve him of his nag and of his clothes, and hanging on one of these oaks in scorn of the Orsini?" To which proposal all agreeing, they bade Pietro strip himself, but while already divining his fate, he was so doing, an ambuscade of full 25 men at arms fell suddenly upon them, crying, "Death! Death!" Thus surprised, they let Pietro go and stood on the defensive, but, seeing that the enemy greatly outnumbered them, they took to their heels, the others giving chase. Whereupon Pietro hastily resumed his clothes, mounted his nag, and fled with all speed in the direction which he had seen the damsel take. But finding no road or path through the forest, nor discerning any trace of a horse's hoofs, he was, for that he found not the damsel, albeit he deemed himself safe out of the clutches of his captors and their assailants, the most wretched man alive, and fell a weeping and wandering hither and thither about the forest, uttering Agnolella's name. None answered, but turn back he dared not, so on he went, not knowing whither he went, besides which he was in mortal dread of the wild beasts that infest the forest, as well on account of himself as of the damsel, whom momently he seemed to see throttled by some bear or wolf. Thus did our unfortunate Pietro spend the whole day wandering about the forest, making it to resound with his cries of Agnolella's name, and harking at times back when he thought to go forward, until at last, what with his cries and his tears and his fears and his long fasting, he was so spent that he could go no further. 'Twas then nightfall, and as he knew not what else to do, he dismounted at the foot of an immense oak, and having tethered his nag to the trunk, climbed up into the branches, lest he should be devoured by the wild beasts during the night. Shortly afterwards the moon rose with a very clear sky, and Pietro, who dared not sleep lest he should fall, and indeed had he been secure from that risk, his misery and his anxiety on account of the damsel would not have suffered him to sleep, kept watch, sighing and weeping and cursing his evil luck. Now the damsel, who, as we said before, had fled she knew not whither, allowing her nag to carry her whithersoever he would, strayed so far into the forest that she lost sight of the place where she had entered it, and spent the whole day just as Pietro had done, wandering about the wilderness, pausing from time to time, and weeping and uttering his name, and bewailing her evil fortune. At last, seeing that 'twas now the vesper hour and Pietro came not, she struck into a path which the nag followed, until, after riding some 2 miles, she espied at some distance a cottage, for which she made with all speed, and found there a good man, well stricken in years, with his wife, who was likewise aged. Seeing her ride up alone, they said, "Daughter, wherefore ridest thou thus alone at this hour in these parts?" Weeping, the damsel made answer that she had lost her companion in the forest, and asked how far might Anagni be from there. "My daughter," returned the good man, "this is not the road to Anagni, 'tis more than 12 miles away." "And how far off," inquired the damsel, "are the nearest houses in which one might find lodging for the night?" "There are none so near," replied the good man, "that thou canst reach them today." "Then, so please you," said the damsel, "since go elsewhither I cannot, for God's sake let me pass the night here with you." Whereto the good man made answer, "Damsel, welcome art thou to tarry the night with us, but still thou art to know that these parts are infested both by day and by night by bands, which, be they friends or be they foes, are alike ill to meet with, and not seldom do much despite and mischief, and if by misadventure one of these bands should visit us while thou wert here, and marking thy youth and beauty should do thee despite and dishonor, we should be unable to afford thee any succor. This we would have thee know, that if it should so come to pass, thou mayst not have cause to reproach us." The damsel heard not the old man's word without dismay, but, seeing that the hour was now late, she answered, "God, if he be so pleased, will save both you and me from such molestation, and if not, 'tis a much lesser evil to be maltreated by men than to be torn in pieces by the wild beasts in the forest." So saying, she dismounted and entered the cottage, where, having supped with the poor man and his wife on such humble fare as they had, she laid herself in her clothes beside them in their bed. She slept not, however, for her own evil plight and that of Pietro, for whom she knew not how to augur aught but evil, kept her sighing and weeping all night long. And towards matins she heard a great noise as of men that marched. So up she got, and hied her into a large courtyard that was in the rear of the cottage, and part of which was covered with a great heap of hay, which she espying hid herself therein, that, if the man came there, they might not so readily find her. Scarce had she done so than the man, who proved to be a strong company of marauders, were at the door of the cottage, which they forced open, and having entered and found the damsel's nag still saddled, they asked who was there. The damsel being out of sight, the good man answered, "There is none here but my wife and I, but this nag, which has given some one the slip, found his way hither last night, and we housed him, lest he should be devoured by the wolves." "So," said the chief of the band, "as he has no owner, he will come in very handy for us." Whereupon in several parties they ransacked the cottage from top to bottom, and one party went out into the courtyard, where, as they threw aside their lances and targets, it so befell that one of them, not knowing where else to bestow his lance, tossed it into the hay, and was within an ace of killing the damsel that lay hid there, as likewise she of betraying her whereabouts, for the lance all but grazing her left breast, insomuch that the head tore her apparel, she doubted she was wounded, and had given a great shriek, but that, remembering where she was, she refrained for fear. By and by the company cooked them a breakfast of kids and other meat, and having eaten and drunken, dispersed in divers directions as their affairs required, taking the girl's nag with them. And when they were gotten some little way off, the good man asked his wife, "What became of the damsel, our guest of last night, that I have not seen her since we rose?" The good woman answered that she knew not where the damsel was, and went to look for her. The damsel, discovering that the men were gone, came forth of the hay, and the good man, seeing her, was overjoyed that she had not fallen into the hands of the ruffians, and, as the day was breaking, said to her, "Now that the day is at hand, we will, so it like thee, escort thee to a castle some 5 miles hence, where thou wilt be in safety; but thou must needs go afoot, because these villains that are but just gone have taken thy nag with them." The damsel, resigning herself to her loss, besought them for God's sake to take her to the castle, whereupon they set forth and arrived there about half tierce. Now the castle belonged to one of the Orsini, Lelio di Campo di Fiore by name, whose wife, as it chanced, was there. A most kindly and good woman she was, and recognizing the damsel as soon as she saw her, gave her a hearty welcome, and would fain have from her a particular account of how she came there. So the damsel told her the whole story. The lady, to whom Pietro was also known as being a friend of her husband, was distressed to hear of his misadventure, and being told where he was taken, gave him up for dead. So she said to the damsel, "Since so it is that thou knowest not how Pietro has fared, thou shalt stay here with me until such time as I may have opportunity to send thee safely back to Rome." Meanwhile Pietro, perched on his oak in as woeful a plight as might be, had espied, when he should have been in his first sleep, a full score of wolves that, as they prowled, caught sight of the nag, and straightway were upon him on all sides. The horse, as soon as he was ware of their approach, strained on the reins till they snapped, and tried to make good his escape, but being hemmed in, was brought to bay, and made a long fight of it with his teeth and hoofs, but in the end they bore him down, and throttled him, and forthwith eviscerated him, and the whole pack falling upon him, devoured him to the bone before they had done with him. Whereat Pietro, who felt that in the nag he had lost a companion and a comfort in his travail, was sorely dismayed, and began to think that he should never get out of the forest. But towards dawn he perched there in the oak, almost dead with cold, looking around him, as he frequently did, espied about a mile off a huge fire, wherefore as soon as 'twas broad day he got down, not without trepidation, from the oak, and bent his steps towards the fire, and being come to it, he found, gathered about it, a company of shepherds, eating and making merry, who took pity on him, and made him welcome. And when he had broken his fast and warmed himself, he told them the mishap that had befallen him, and how it was that he was come there alone, and asked them if there was a farm or castle in those parts whither he might betake him. The shepherds said that about 3 miles away there was a castle belonging to Lelio di Campo di Fiore, where his lady was then tarrying. Pietro, much comforted, requested to be guided thither by some of their company, whereupon 2 of them right gladly escorted him. So Pietro arrived at the castle, where he found some that knew him, and while he was endeavoring to set on foot a search for the damsel in the forest, the lady summoned him to her presence, and he, forthwith obeying, and seeing Agnolella with her, was the happiest man that ever was. He yearned till he all but swooned to go and embrace her, but refrained for bashfulness in the lady's presence. And overjoyed as he was, the joy of the damsel was no less. The lady received him with great cheer, and though, when she had heard the story of his adventures from his own lips, she chid him not a little for having set at naught the wishes of his kinsfolk, yet, seeing that he was still of the same mind, and that the damsel was also constant, she said to herself, "To what purpose give I myself all this trouble? They love one another, they know one another, they love with equal ardor, their love is honorable, and I doubt not is well pleasing to God, seeing that the one has escaped the gallows, and the other the lance, and both the wild beasts. Wherefore be it as they would have it." Then turning to them she said, If 'tis your will to be joined in wedlock as man and wife, mine jumps with it. Here shall your nuptials be solemnized, and at Liello's charges, and for the rest I will see that your peace is made with your kinsfolk. So in the castle the pair were wedded, Pietro only less blithe than Agnolella, the lady ordering the nuptials as honourably as might be in her mountain home, and there they had most sweet joyance of the first fruits of their love. So some days they tarried there, and then, accompanied by the lady with a strong escort, they took horse and returned to Rome, where, very wroth though she found Pietro's kinsfolk for what he had done, the lady re-established solid peace between him and them, and so at Rome Pietro and Agnolella lived together to a good old age in great tranquillity and happiness. End of Day 5, the third story.